Hello everyone, my name is Volker Holman. For around 40 years, I have been involved in pre-industrial historical steel manufacturing, the original form of steel production, and would like to tell you a little about it. First, I should introduce myself and, above all, show what I have done in order to understand what our ancestors did from iron ore. Why did they do it that way in the past? Why they did it? What possibilities they had? What their steel could, and the old steel could not do. Steel is one of the most important products of mankind. It determines our entire life today. Steel production in Europe began around 800 years before Christ. Until the 13th century, all steel was produced in the same way. Before we go any further, however, we need to answer the most important fundamental question. What is historical steel production? What is the difference between the first steel and today's modern industrial steel? The answer is simple. The melting of the steel. Iron ore, which consists of an iron-oxygen compound, is mainly used to produce steel. The old steel-making process only works with charcoal. Until the 18th century, charcoal was the most efficient fuel. In the first step, the iron ore was mixed with charcoal and heated to high temperatures in a furnace. Compressed air is needed to reach the process temperatures. The carbon monoxide produced by burning the charcoal reduces the iron ore at these high temperatures. However, the steel does not become liquid. If the steel were to become liquid, it would immediately become saturated with carbon. The result is cast iron. Cast iron is not forgeable, because the temperature development of the charcoal is not sufficient to bring the iron into the melt. A still forgeable sponge iron is produced. However, the short reduction time of the iron ore is not sufficient to transform the iron in its entirety. Only a crude steel, a preliminary product, is produced. A blade forged directly from this raw steel has no strength. It would be useless. The pictures show how Daniels Whistler compacts and welds such an iron sponge. It really is a sponge. The hammer sinks in deeply with the first hits. It first has to be compacted before it can be forged realistically. In this ground piece of sponge iron, you can see that there are still many cavities in the raw steel. They later form part of the pattern that is created in the steel. An iron sponge is absolutely not homogeneous. It consists of very different zones. The settling ore documents the process of reduction in the glow of the furnace. It is up to the blacksmith whether he breaks the sponge and sorts it according to quality, or whether he welds it as a whole. The steel only acquires its stability and strength when centimeters of this steel have been forged into meters of length. Phases are created. The raw steel still needs high temperatures and a lot of stretching to mature. So we see how Daniels Whistler forges the steel, folds it in the middle and fire welds it. This process is carried out until a usable steel is produced. To give an example, many Japanese swordsmiths fold their steel up to 10 times. However, this only works if a usable crude steel can be produced at all, and that's where the problems begin. The Japanese are still masters of this technique today. They can produce a very high quality of steel. Most crude steel that is otherwise produced experimentally disintegrates after the first welding processes. The steel doesn't get better, it gets worse. Even as a child, I was interested in Japanese swords, especially the craftsmanship. That was my thing. Making an absolute art object out of stone or sand, creating something beautiful out of nothing. That was what I wanted to achieve. I then did a lot of reading and very quickly realized that the process of reducing iron ore in a furnace and producing crude steel, which then has to be further processed by forging and welding to get a usable steel at all, that this workflow, which traditional Japanese swordsmiths still use today, is ubiquitous in the worldwide history of earliest steelmaking. It can be found with the Celts, the Romans, in the Persian region, in Africa, in India, everywhere. This is the original form of steelmaking. Over the years of forging, initially of course, I have also pattern welded, made of industrial steel. Then I started experimenting more and more with iron ores. First I looked for old steels in the scrap yard, old wagon tires, and so on, which were produced in the reduction furnace by our ancestors. First I welded them together, mixed with modern industrial steel. And later I made my own steel exclusively with iron ore for years, and produced edged weapons, mainly Japanese blades, which is the biggest market in this field. I had already examined old steels at the beginning. I've been doing that for over 30 years now. At that time, there were hardly any useful facts about the historical European blacksmith's craft. The best source of information was the Japanese professional circles. Welding industrial steel has never been something historic for me. In the beginning it was just simple pieces, from flea markets, scrap yards, wherever, everything from tools to wheel tires, fittings, nails, everything made from this old steel. I later met a very ambitious collector. We had the same interests. In this way, I was able to remove rust from high-quality originals that are normally displayed behind glass in museum showcases. This made it possible to make the steels visible again with an art polish. This allowed me to examine the steel in different ways. Over the last 30 years, I have examined countless old steels that were made in the earliest form of steel production. I can show you this here. This is my latest project at the moment. This is an original knight's sword from the years around 1350. Southern German. The blade is completely oxidized. The steel surface is not visible, except for a few places where the rust has eaten away the grain of the steel. The phasing of the steel can be seen through the rust. Rust is deceptive. It reacts to differences in quality that cannot be seen with the naked eye. Otherwise the steel, the entire blade, is still covered with a layer of oxide. Now still. In the pictures you can see some of the pieces I have examined in the past. They are not only weapons. In order to understand how many possibilities there are for modifying this special iron material, you have to look at all steels from all centuries all over Europe. During the art polishing, I examined the bare steel more extensively. I tried everything to gather as much information as possible. It can be said that they have all been subjected to the forging, folding, and welding process. The steels are never the same. You always find something different. Each steel was made by hand. The differences in materials and variations are almost infinite. With high-quality pieces, you will find well-thought-out concepts that have been refined over generations. Countless blacksmiths have had thousands of years to experiment with this non-melted steel. An excellent example of this is this torsion spather from the Viking Age. Twisting lead steel rods and inserting them into a sword blade was one of the most outstanding techniques of the time. This spather was forged purely as a fighting tool. It was of the highest quality, yet simple and plain. Deep battle nicks bear witness to fierce fighting. There is also evidence that it was carried by several warriors over generations. This blade was crafted with the highest level of blacksmithing by an absolutely masterful hand. What is amazing is that the blade is not hardened. This means that this blade is actually only slightly harder than copper. Like many such blades, it is only a very thin blade, about 4.5 millimeters thick at the root, tapering to 2 millimeters at the tip. This is not an isolated finding. From the beginning of the Iron Age, for around 2,000 years, many swords in Europe were not hardened with carbon. This is still one of the unsolved mysteries today. Since such blades are generally not suitable for fighting, they have no spring force. However, the blade we examined has spring force. Steel, which is not produced by melting, is a very special iron material, with its own laws and possibilities, which our ancestors knew how to use. So I started polishing old original steels right at the beginning of my forging career, in order to gather facts. It is not a fantasy. There is a clear specification, the work of our ancestors. It was clear that the composite of industrial steel, these hard and soft layers, could not be historical. To equate the earliest steel production with finished modern industrial steel, simply because it is also fire-welded, is an absolute contradiction. Common sense should be enough to realize that this cannot be true. The earliest steel production cannot be reconstructed with the most modern steel. But it has been practiced to this day, because it is much simpler. On the subject of Damascus steel, I should perhaps explain that I was a young budding blacksmith when the welding of modern industrial steels became historical steel production. At the end of the 80s, I completed an internship with the blacksmith Manfred Sachs. As far as I know, he was the only fully professional blacksmith in the German-speaking region at the time who produced this so-called Damascus steel. Sachs was writing his book on Damascus steel at the time. It was one of the first modern reference books on the historical craft of blacksmithing. He never worked realistically with iron ores. His book suggested that the welding of hard and soft layers of industrial steel was historical steel production. This is how the myth of Damascus steel began in German-speaking countries. I realized then that we really didn't know anything about the old craft. The picture shows a typical Damascus steel, consisting of hardened and soft steel layers. This welded steel composite was not found in Europe until the 18th century. Two prerequisites are necessary to produce such a clearly characterized steel composite. The carbon must be strongly bound in the iron so that it does not diffuse and create a blurred image. Such a clear pattern cannot be created with steel that is not produced in the melt. The second requirement is the hardenability of the steel. All modern hardenable industrial steels contain alloying elements. The alloying elements enhance hardening. In any introduction to the hardening of steel, it is stated on the first pages that a steel that has no alloying elements can only be hardened to a material thickness of around 4 mm. Steel that is not produced in the melt cannot have any alloying elements. Without melting the steel, there is no alloy. All steels that are not produced in the melt only have narrow hardenings along the thin cutting edge. The most famous example is the Japanese sword. It is often assumed that Japanese swordsmiths deliberately create only a narrow hardening along the cutting edge. The truth is that the steel does not allow any further hardening. This narrow hardening along the cutting edge is found in all non-fused steels. Worldwide, anyone who produces their steel correctly from iron or in the reduction furnace, used in the earlier days, and hardens such a blade later, only obtains a narrow hardening along the cutting edge. The picture shows a blade I made decades ago, which shows the correct hardness ratios of European historic steels. This stepped hardening is the full hardening capacity of a steel that was not produced in the melt. The image in this steel is absolutely typical of historic steels. A grain consisting of oxide lines, and a stepped hardening along the cutting edge. It is obvious that this image of steel in no way corresponds to the composite of industrial steel, based on hardened and soft steel layers. The relationship to Japanese blades is absolutely obvious. No wonder. It is the same steel manufacturing process and it is the same steel. These connections are still practically unknown today. From this you can see that only a few blacksmiths in Europe have managed to correctly reproduce the historical steel production process. Anyone who produces their own steel from iron or in a furnace will inevitably get this image of a hardened blade. You can't create hard soft layers with the old steel. This is only possible with today's alloyed industrial steel. With the old, non-melted steel, only the thin cutting edge is hardened. The higher the steel quality, the purer the steel and the optimum the carbon content. The broader the hardening, the more resilient the hardened steel and the higher the hardness that can be achieved. I have tempered many such blades. If everything is optimized, such a steel made directly from iron ore can only be hardened to a thickness of 4 mm. Then the formation of martensite quickly stops and the rest of the blade no longer accepts hardening. The Japanese sword, as it has been made with a simple reduction furnace since 1600, is not an isolated case. On the contrary, it is the most widely used historical steel production method in the world. With an art polish you can make the old steels of different cultures visible. The same image always appears as with Japanese swords. As I said, a completely different world. Welding industrial steel and what you find in the originals are not identical. It's completely different. Apart from fire welding, there are no similarities. Later, I also worked in a metallurgical laboratory. The most important examination in metallurgy is the determination of the steel composition. The most common composition of old steels is that of pure iron. As in the skilled trades, the mistake is also made in metallurgy, that historical steels are equated with modern industrial steels. One example. In modern industrial steel, there is only one steel quality in the composition of pure iron. In the case of steels that are not produced in the melt, there are countless iron materials with extremely different properties in the composition of pure iron. And it is precisely this special area that our ancestors used to produce different types of steel. We no longer have these possibilities with our new modern industrial steel. The problem we still have today is that we do not understand that we cannot transfer the properties of modern industrial steel directly to steel that is not produced in the melt. Specifically, practically all evaluations of metallurgical investigations contain a very large error in reasoning. Historical steel production is extremely difficult to understand. It is very complicated. By examining the artifacts, I have found many things that were apparently common knowledge among blacksmiths in the past. They knew all that. It was normal. It was forgotten, but are still completely unknown today. I have summarized my experiences and all my scientific research in a book of 500 pages. I can say that I know a lot about historical steel production. I have mastered the same craft and compared everything with the results from the examinations of the originals. My conclusion is very clear. We know very, very little about the historical steelmaking craft. The background is still unknown today. Our current knowledge is still so limited that we don't even see the big context. It is important to understand that the craft that Japanese traditional swordsmiths still use today is the historic steelmaking craft used worldwide. Nevertheless, there are very big differences. In Europe, the simple reduction furnace was used more than 5 times longer than in Japan, on a much greater area with many more forges, which actually had little contact with each other. The European artifacts have much more superficial heat treatments. Such techniques are not found in Japanese steels. On the other hand, the old cow toe forging technique is not found in Europe. Regrind in use and heavily corroded, often only tenths of a millimeter thick layers from the heat treatments are preserved in European steels. This is a major problem, because the steel may not be ground down. The most important information would be lost. Particularly high-quality artifacts must be polished directly. In the knight's sword of 1350, these bright spots are the highest points and the only remnants of the former surface. Just a quick grind and this important information is lost forever. The fire welding of steels is as old as steel production itself. Even the earliest steels had to be forged and fire welded in order to obtain a usable steel. The development of steel production in Europe was initially very slow. For 2,000 years, one and the same steel was produced, which never reached the smelter. In the 13th century, the installations were increasingly powered by water. The furnaces became larger, and some of them even managed to melt the steel. This was not at all desirable at the time. The aim was always to obtain a malleable sponge iron. The steel that ended up in the smelter was considered spoiled and was probably initially discarded. In the following centuries, more and more steel was produced in the smelter for reasons of economy. The whole process of steelmaking, all problems, changed fundamentally. It was now necessary to invent new techniques, known as fission, to remove the carbon from the non-malleable crude steel and obtain a malleable steel. Fire welding was used from the beginning of steel production in Europe, 800 years before Christ until the middle of the 19th century. All steels, including the later steels produced in the smelting process, had to be finely refined or cleaned by forging and fire welding. It was only when Henry Bessemer introduced a new process in 1855 that forging and fire welding were no longer needed. Until then, practically all steels, with one small exception, had to be forged and fire welded. With the old techniques, it would not be possible to produce as much steel as we need today. It was at the middle of the 19th century that Henry Bessemer introduced a process that made it possible to produce enormous quantities of steel in a very short time. That was the breakthrough, the time when we had steel in abundance. From the world of welding steels, 3 groups are particularly relevant for this report. The first group is the fire welding of finished modern industrial steels. The result is a generous black and white pattern that is easy to understand. It is a contemporary art of forging because everything is so beautifully simple. The second group is the production of steel from iron or in a furnace. The craft that our ancestors practiced over thousands of years. You make the steel yourself, you have a lot of possibilities to influence the steel. And our ancestors made full use of these possibilities. The problem is that all these possibilities no longer exist at all in industrial steel. The grains that can be created in this non-melted steel are almost endless. It is a huge variety. No two steels are the same. It is extremely difficult to examine this steel. In my opinion, the best instrument is the art polish. It gives the most accurate and realistic information about these steels. The metallurgical test is not really suitable for specifying such steels, because there are simply too many groups of different steels combined in one definition in this test. Artistic polishing has a huge disadvantage. It has to be learned. You have to know how to see what is relevant, what you have to pay attention to, how what can be evaluated. That makes the field a lot more difficult. You can see it in the Japanese experts to be able to read such polishes. The third group, and I am privileged here, the masterpieces. I have been able to examine the steel for days and weeks. I have not only seen it millimeter by millimeter, but I have also felt it. And the longer I do this, the more I realize what ingenious and special concept our ancestors used to produce an optimal steel. These are concepts that have been thought through to the smallest detail. Now, I don't think we will ever be able to reach the same high level of blacksmithing as our ancestors did. It's not possible. We don't have the generations and millennia to experiment with this non-melting steel, to master it in such a way that we can produce steels and put them together in a way that really maximizes their utility value in tools and weapons. Another problem is that we still don't understand what historical steelmaking is really about. All the knowledge about the influence on steels has been lost for centuries. I would say, we don't know much, and the problem is that we are far from understanding that there is something we just haven't seen yet. For over 30 years, I have been doing everything I can in German-speaking countries to prevent welded industrial steel from being regarded as a historical forging technique, with very little success. I have experienced a lot in this context. People only want what they can do, what is advantageous for them. They are not prepared to accept anything more. It's very difficult, and I've really experienced a lot. My conclusion is that we will never again reach the high level of our ancestors in realistic old steel production. It is a small step and easy to understand that historical steelmaking cannot be done with industrial steel, and that we have not even managed to dispel this myth for over 30 years. And if I couldn't even correct such obvious misinformation within decades, how difficult it must be to set the record straight on the realistic work of our forefathers. I would like to end my contribution at this point. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching.
Vielen Dank fürs Zuschauen.